He stands alone at the luxury stud farm, swallowing humiliation as he fights to save the battered horse no one wants. He doesn't realize their bond will challenge every cruel assumption and reshape both their futures. The midday sun hung high above the rolling hills, casting long shadows across the sprawling grounds of the Royal Crest Stud Farm. Sleek, expensive horses roamed behind polished fences, each animal a testament to prestige and careful breeding. Horse trailers and elegant carriages lined the main drive, while owners and trainers, dressed in crisp shirts and tailored riding jackets, moved about with an air of quiet confidence. All around, conversations buzzed with talk of lineage, performance records, and the sky-high prices wealthy buyers were willing to pay for a champion. Amid the bustle, a weary figure stepped off an old, rattling pickup truck. His name was Jonah, a modest farmer clad in faded overalls, with dusty boots that had seen better days. Unlike the rest of the visitors who arrived in polished SUVs or horse vans, Jonah stood out in every way. He had saved for years to come here, not to buy the most prized colt, but simply to find a healthy, reasonably priced horse for his humble farm. His late father's dream had been to see the family's land revitalized with good stock, and Jonah was determined to fulfill that wish, even if everyone here looked at him as though he had no business setting foot on this luxurious property. It did not take long for Jonah to feel the weight of the glances thrown his way. Stable hands paused in their work, their eyes flicking over his worn clothes and calloused hands. A well-dressed couple standing near the registration desk whispered something under their breath, and a tall, sharply dressed breeder openly sneered when Jonah asked about the horses soon to be auctioned. Still, Jonah held his head high. He tried to hide his unease as he walked across the meticulously kept courtyard, heading for the large training ring where prospective buyers gathered to see the yearlings trot. Within the ring, a series of magnificent young horses paraded in graceful arcs, their coats gleaming. One after another, they showed off their lineage, champion bloodlines from sires whose names dominated the equestrian world. The auctioneer reeled off each horse's pedigree with practiced flourish, describing past victories and the promise of future glory. As the bids soared into the thousands, then tens of thousands, Jonah felt his heart sink. He had hoped to find a healthy horse at a reasonable price, but this was a world far beyond his means. At the edge of the ring, an older gentleman with a neatly trimmed beard addressed Jonah as though the farmhand were a child lost in a foreign city. "You'll not find anything under 10,000 here," he said with thinly veiled pity. "We breed winners, not mere workhorses. Best you try your luck at a smaller sale." Jonah tried to ignore the man's patronizing tone. He said nothing in reply, but he didn't leave either. Instead, he patiently waited, scanning the lineup of colts. He had faith that perhaps there was an overlooked horse somewhere on these grounds, one that needed a second chance as much as Jonah needed a reliable companion to help him on his farm. The sun crept lower as more horses were shown, each one commanding rapt attention from the wealthy bidders. Yet Jonah noticed something curious. A final stall, separated from the immaculate horses, housed a tall, thin bay colt. His coat, once a glossy brown, had lost its luster, and a faint scar ran along his flank. The colt's head hung low, and he avoided eye contact with the bustling crowd. It was as if he knew he did not belong among the polished champions parading in the main ring. No one else spared that horse so much as a glance. Trainers walked by without pausing, and the stable staff seemed eager to ignore his presence. Jonah felt a tug in his chest. Something about the quiet sadness in the horse's posture called out to him, reminding him of his own feeling of not belonging in this upscale world. Cautiously, Jonah approached, aware of the prying eyes that might judge him for poking around a horse that had apparently been deemed worthless. A young stable hand holding a clipboard noticed Jonah. "That one's not in the main auction," he offered, almost apologetically. "He's from a line that didn't pan out, and, well, there were some injuries. Temperament issues, too." Jonah ran a hand over the colt's neck, feeling coarse hair where there should have been a healthy shine. The horse flinched at first, but gradually relaxed under Jonah's gentle touch. "He looks like he's had a rough time," Jonah said quietly, meeting the colt's dark eyes. "What's his name?" The stable hand hesitated. "He doesn't have a name. Around here, he's just known by a lot number. If you're interested in him, you can talk to Mr. Davenport. He's the stable master." The stable hand gestured toward a stately man with a fixed scowl, standing near one of the fancier stalls. Jonah squared his shoulders and went to find Mr. Davenport, who was busy discussing breeding fees with a prospective buyer. As soon as Jonah cleared his throat to speak, Davenport's eyebrows shot up. "Yes?" "What is it?" he snapped, hardly concealing his annoyance at being interrupted. Jonah cleared his throat once more. "I'm interested in the bay colt over in the far stall." He tried to keep his voice steady, though his heart thumped with nerves. "I'd like to know what his price is." Davenport arched an eyebrow, a mix of surprise and disdain crossing his features. "You mean lot number 147? He's not part of the main sale. Let's just say he's a leftover from a line that showed no promise. Small heart, easily injured. We don't bother listing him formally." Davenport's lips twisted into a thin smirk. "If you want him, you can have him for next to nothing." Sensing the insult in Davenport's words, Jonah swallowed the sting of shame. "I'll pay whatever he's worth," he said earnestly, pulling out a worn envelope from his back pocket. Inside were his meager savings, carefully counted and set aside. "I just want a good horse to help on my farm. I can't afford a champion, but—" Davenport let out a derisive laugh that seemed to echo in the wide corridor. Heads turned at the sound, and a few onlookers sneered or snickered as they recognized Jonah from earlier. "It doesn't take much to buy a horse no one wants," Davenport announced loudly, clearly enjoying the scene he was creating. "But fine. If you're so determined, take him. I doubt you'll get anything worthwhile out of that animal." Jonah felt his cheeks burn, but he kept his voice level. "I'll take him." He handed over his money, every dollar he had saved. Even though Davenport sneered, Jonah couldn't help but feel hope flutter in his chest. Perhaps this bedraggled colt simply needed someone to see beyond his flaws. Jonah understood that feeling all too well. A small crowd had gathered by the time Jonah returned to the neglected stall. They watched as he carefully slipped a halter over the horse's head. The colt skittered, eyes wide, uncertain of Jonah's intentions. In the hush, Jonah murmured reassurances, his gentle words a stark contrast to the ridiculing whispers around them. Gradually, the horse settled, though it was clear he remained fearful. Someone in the crowd muttered, "That farmer's a fool. Doesn't he know how expensive it is to rehabilitate a lame horse?" Another chimed in, "That creature will never do more than drain his wallet." But Jonah blocked out their voices, focusing on the horse trembling under his hand. "I won't hurt you," Jonah whispered. "We'll go at your pace. Everything's going to change for you. I promise." Slowly, the horse's trembling subsided. The hush felt charged, as though no one expected the broken-down colt to respond to kindness. It was only when Jonah led the horse toward his rusty pickup truck that the full scope of the crowd's condescension became painfully clear. Laughter rang out the moment they saw the chipped trailer fastened behind Jonah's old truck. Polished grooms whispered to one another, pointing at the sorry spectacle. A wealthy breeder quipped, "That rig fits the horse's worth, doesn't it?" The comment drew nasty smiles from several onlookers. Determined not to show that their mockery stung, Jonah guided the nervous colt up the makeshift ramp. The horse hesitated, eyes darting, but Jonah urged him gently forward. After a few tense moments, the horse reluctantly stepped inside, drawn more by Jonah's soothing voice than by any sense of comfort in the battered trailer. Jonah backed out carefully, secured the door, and patted the truck's side as if to reassure both the horse and himself. With a final glance at the array of wealthy buyers and polished riders, Jonah climbed into the driver's seat. As he pulled away from the shimmering stud farm, Jonah's mind churned with a whirl of excitement and doubt. He wasn't blind to the horse's condition. There was an old scar near the colt's left shoulder, and the horse's gait was uneven, possibly from a past injury. Still, Jonah believed that even the most forsaken creature deserved a chance. The farm he'd grown up on was far from prosperous, but it offered a quiet, open space, free from the judgment and harsh demands of a place like Royal Crest. Maybe that was exactly what this horse needed. Back on his family's land, Jonah parked the truck near a small wooden stable he had patched up himself. Evening light spilled over weathered fences and acres of pasture dotted with wild grass. The old structure was not grand by any means, but it was tidy and calm, worlds away from the opulence of the stud farm. The colt shuffled nervously inside the trailer, stomping and snorting at the unfamiliar setting. Jonah moved slowly, humming a tune his father used to sing when life felt uncertain. Easing the colt down the ramp, Jonah led him into a stall scattered with fresh hay. For a few tense moments, the horse circled the space, ears pinned back, eyes rolling. His sides heaved with short, frantic breaths, as though expecting something terrible to happen. Jonah stayed with him, patient and still, letting the horse explore and settle at his own pace. Eventually, the colt stopped and turned his head, regarding Jonah with a blend of wariness and curious expectation. Kneeling down so his posture was less threatening, Jonah murmured, "I need to give you a name, don't I? Something that fits all that courage you're hiding." He gazed at the horse's battered coat, the faint outline of old muscles that hinted at better days. "How about Orion?" he said softly, recalling the constellation his father loved to point out on clear nights, a star in the darkness. At the sound of Jonah's gentle voice, the horse's ears twitched, his gaze still guarded, but no longer frantic. Jonah could hardly believe he had ended up here with a horse so many had dismissed as useless. And yet, in the deepening twilight, he saw the flicker of something in Orion's eyes, a spark, perhaps, or merely a reflection of Jonah's hope. It was enough. Jonah rose, feeling the ache in his tired limbs and the swirl of unspoken questions in his mind. He took a final, long look at the horse that had been deemed worthless by experts and wealthy breeders alike. "They say you're no champion," Jonah whispered, "but let's see what you and I can prove together." Outside, nightfall drew across the sky, and the first stars began to glimmer. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Orion would need care, a vet's checkup, and above all, consistent kindness to rebuild his body and spirit. Jonah had little money left, but he had hope, and he would fight with everything he had to make that hope a reality. The next morning dawned with a dusty haze over Jonah's modest farm, and as he stepped outside, the first thing he noticed was Orion's soft nicker coming from the stable. The horse seemed to have weathered the night calmly enough, though his eyes still harbored a touch of caution. Jonah offered a gentle greeting, carrying a bucket of fresh water and the simplest feed he could afford. He felt a pang of guilt at how meager the rations were compared to the lavish diet Orion might have received at a high-end stud farm, but he reminded himself that kindness could go far. Orion sniffed the air and flicked his tail, accepting Jonah's presence with tentative curiosity. The horse's flank still showed the faint scar from an old wound, and Jonah made a mental note to find a vet who could give a full assessment. Until then, his plan was to move slowly, allow Orion time to adjust, and maybe build a routine that would soothe the colt's nerves. Jonah had never undertaken such an ambitious project before, but something in Orion's gaze spurred him on. He finished setting the water down, murmuring, "We'll do this together, boy." "You're safe here." He spent that morning tending to daily chores, mucking out stalls, repairing fence boards, and spreading fresh straw so Orion would have a warm place to stand. The repetitive work calmed Jonah's mind, pushing aside lingering echoes of the cruel laughter at the stud farm. By midday, the sun beat down with punishing heat, and Jonah paused to drink from a battered canteen. He peered into Orion's stall, checking on him in the shade. The horse picked at the hay, not devouring it with zeal, but at least he was eating. Jonah exhaled, relieved to see signs of cautious acceptance. As the afternoon stretched on, Jonah wondered whether he should seek professional help. A local veterinarian named Erin Summers often made rounds in the area, but Jonah had never hired her before. Still, his father had always said that no good farmer shied away from calling in an expert when it mattered. With that in mind, Jonah located Erin's number in an old directory, hoping she might have the time and interest to visit. Surprisingly, Erin arrived 2 days later, pulling up in a practical vehicle rather than the polished trucks Jonah had seen at the stud farm. She stepped out with a warm, no-nonsense smile, introduced herself, and asked where Orion was kept. Jonah guided her across the yard, feeling a blend of relief and nerves. Erin had grown up nearby, she said, and understood how rough farmland could be on both man and beast. When she saw Orion, she let out a low whistle. "He's a handsome one," she remarked, gently stroking his muzzle. "But he's clearly been through a lot." Jonah nodded, standing back so Erin could work. She ran her hands over Orion's legs, checked his hooves, peered into his mouth, and listened to his heartbeat. He was underweight and showed signs of past neglect, especially around that scarred flank. Orion tensed whenever she moved too abruptly, but he didn't bolt. Erin's brow furrowed, and she patted the horse's shoulder. "The limp in his left hind leg might never fully disappear," she said gently. "He could improve with careful exercise, though, and proper hoof care. He'll also need better feed and some supplements to rebuild muscle." Jonah exhaled, feeling the weight of a fresh worry. Money. Still, he managed a determined nod. "I just want him to have a decent life," he said. "He doesn't need to run races or jump fences. If he can wander the fields and help me a bit around the farm, that'll be enough." Erin studied him thoughtfully, sensing the sincerity in his words. She explained how to introduce new feeds, what signs to watch for, and how best to clean the horse's scarred area without causing further pain. Jonah listened carefully, grateful for her calm expertise. Before leaving, Erin jotted down her number on a small card and handed it to Jonah. "If you run into trouble, call me," she said, offering a friendly smile. "You're doing something good here," Jonah thanked her, feeling a flash of relief that at least one person believed he wasn't chasing a foolish dream. Watching Erin drive off, he thought about the days ahead, bracing himself for the cost of veterinary follow-ups and new feed. Still, a spark of optimism fluttered in his chest. Orion was officially on the road to recovery, and Jonah was no longer stumbling in the dark. That evening, Jonah approached Orion with a brush, determined to start a simple grooming routine. The colt eyed him, ears flicking back and forth as though uncertain about the object in Jonah's hand. Moving slowly, Jonah let him sniff the brush first. When Orion seemed curious rather than fearful, Jonah began gentle strokes along the horse's neck. The dull, tangled hair came loose in small clumps. Orion flinched once, but Jonah paused, gave him a moment, then resumed. After a while, Orion lowered his head and relaxed, letting Jonah work without protest. That small sign of trust made Jonah's chest swell with hope. He kept brushing, humming an aimless tune he remembered from his childhood. The methodical motions soothed them both. Bit by bit, some of Orion's coat began to show a subtle shine where the dust and tangles had been. The sight filled Jonah with quiet pride. He stepped away eventually, storing the brush in a simple wooden box. "You did well," he murmured, giving Orion a soft pat on the withers. "We're getting somewhere, you and I." The next day, Jonah's routine fell into a steady pattern. He fed Orion in the early morning, then turned him out for short strolls in a small paddock. The limp remained, but the horse seemed determined to place weight on that hind leg. By late afternoon, Jonah would work on grooming or simply stand near Orion, letting him grow accustomed to a human presence. The calmness of these sessions contrasted sharply with Jonah's memories of that loud, glittering stud farm, where everything revolved around perfection and profit. Meanwhile, word of Jonah's purchase began to spread. A neighbor who spotted the weary colt in Jonah's trailer mentioned it at the feed store, and soon folks were talking. Most dismissed the horse as a lost cause, but a few quietly rooted for Jonah, remembering his late father's devotion. They hoped the farmer's determination might yield a final small miracle. Whenever Jonah drove into town for supplies, he sensed the curiosity surrounding him. Some locals offered well-meaning advice. Try warm compresses on the leg, or mix a bit of molasses into his feed. Others gave pitying looks that hinted at their skepticism. Jonah accepted it all with a polite nod, then loaded his truck with fresh hay, the supplements Erin had recommended, and any odds and ends he could afford to improve Orion's stall. Back at the farm, day by day, Orion's spirit began to change. He still startled at sudden noises, a passing tractor or the clang of metal, but he no longer withdrew as soon as Jonah approached. Instead, the horse would watch him quietly, ears twitching with interest. Jonah introduced short walks around the pasture fence, letting Orion pick his own pace. Though the limp was obvious, Erin's guidance about regular, gentle exercise seemed to be helping. She stopped by on weekends to check his progress and noted that his weight was improving, his eyes showing more alertness. Every evening, Jonah closed out the day by walking beside Orion, trailed by the orange glow of sunset. He would talk softly about his father's dream, the farmland's challenges, and the embarrassment he felt that day at the stud farm. Speaking the words aloud helped him realize they held no power unless he chose to cling to them. Sometimes, Orion would graze on wild grass and pay Jonah little mind. Other times, the colt would stand beside him, head lifted, as if listening to the low murmur of Jonah's voice. In these gentle moments, Jonah could practically feel a fragile yet growing trust blossoming between them. Night settled softly over Jonah's farmland, the hush broken only by the rustle of leaves and the muted clamor of crickets. Through the thin walls of the stable, Jonah could hear Orion shifting in his stall. The horse's movements had become more assured lately, no longer the tentative scufflings of a creature poised to flee at the slightest sound. Instead, there was a quiet rhythm, as though Orion's legs and heart were gradually remembering what it felt like to belong somewhere. Jonah finished his final round of evening chores and found himself pausing by the stable door. Inside, a warm lantern glow revealed Orion standing with his head lowered toward fresh hay. Though the horse was still underweight, his coat had begun to show signs of a healthier sheen. The sight brought Jonah a kind of peace he had never known. Each small improvement felt like proof that his choice, once mocked by so many, was the right one. He leaned against a post, recalling the first moments he'd seen Orion at the luxury stud farm. Back then, the horse's eyes had looked so defeated, his future written off as worthless. Jonah had known that feeling. He still remembered the sting of hearing wealthy buyers laugh at his old truck and battered boots. Yet here, far from that place, neither he nor Orion was defined by anyone else's expectations. Morning arrived with a sky full of pale gold. Jonah emerged from his small house just as the sun cleared the horizon. He savored a few breaths of crisp air before heading to Orion's stall. The horse greeted him with a soft nicker, as though recognizing his footsteps. Jonah gently placed a bucket of feed by the open door. Orion's ears flicked, and after a moment of indecision, he stepped forward to eat. Such a simple act, eating in Jonah's presence, marked a quiet victory of trust. With routine feeding and grooming complete, Jonah turned his attention to the endless to-do list that kept his farm limping along. Fences needed mending, fields required clearing of debris, and the aging irrigation system threatened to fail at any moment. But he refused to rush off without first tending to Orion's exercises. Erin had stressed the importance of gradual movement to help with Orion's hind leg stiffness, so Jonah led the colt out to the small paddock behind the stable. The ground there was soft enough to minimize strain on old injuries. It was a slow, measured walk, with Jonah keeping pace by Orion's shoulder. The horse's ears were pricked forward, nostrils flaring as he took in the sense of open space. Occasionally, he snorted or tossed his head, perhaps testing whether Jonah's calm tone could anchor him in this new world. Each lap around the paddock felt like confirmation that the scars of Orion's past did not have to define his future. His limp, while still visible, did not stop him from placing one hoof in front of the other. By late afternoon, Jonah had hammered the last nail into a loose fence board when he noticed a pickup rolling up his driveway. It was Tom, a neighboring farmer who had known Jonah's family for years. Tom climbed out, a friendly grin lighting up his sun-aged face. "I heard you got yourself a horse," he said, leaning against the side of his truck. "Figured I'd come by to see if the rumors were true." Jonah wiped sweat from his brow and nodded. "He's in the stable, if you'd like to meet him." Tom followed Jonah through the barn entrance, where Orion watched them from the far side of his stall. Even to a casual observer, the horse appeared wary, muscles taut from memories of harsh handling. Tom's eyes narrowed with compassion. "Poor fella's been through the ringer, hasn't he?" Jonah explained how he had acquired Orion for next to nothing at the stud farm, how the horse had been overlooked as a failure. Tom shook his head. "Some folks don't give an animal a second chance if it doesn't meet their perfect standards. You did right by him, Jonah." Tom reached into his jacket pocket, producing a small bag of homemade horse treats. He held them out to Jonah with a wink. "My wife and I sometimes spoil our ponies with these. Might help this big boy feel more at home." Jonah accepted the treats gratefully. He offered one to Orion, who sniffed the unfamiliar scent before taking a cautious nibble. The crinkle of the treat between his teeth broke the silence, and Jonah felt an unexpected swell of pride. Not so long ago, the horse would have shied away or refused to eat at a stranger's approach. Now, a single treat had become a sign that trust could extend beyond Jonah. Before Tom left, he took a brief tour of the farm, noting areas where Jonah's fencing or tools needed upgrading. "If you ever need an extra hand, just say the word," Tom said, his voice warm. "We're neighbors after all, and I'd love to see how this colt turns out." Jonah thanked him, genuinely moved by the offer. As much as he tried to keep his pride intact, he knew that accepting help was often the wisest step. That evening, after Tom's truck disappeared down the road, Jonah lingered with Orion in the paddock. Fireflies danced in the tall grass, tiny sparks illuminating the night. He absently scratched Orion's withers, marveling at how the horse no longer flinched at a raised hand. The day's work had been exhausting, But the progress he felt with Orion brightened Jonah's mood. Perhaps, he thought, this was what his father had meant by raising more than crops, the sense of fulfillment that came from nurturing life. Time slid into a comfortable rhythm. Over the next few weeks, Orion's stride grew steadier and his coat took on a richer hue, though small bumps and ridges still hinted at old malnourishment. Erin visited regularly, bringing specialized liniments and additional nutritional tips. Each examination showed slight improvements, even if the horse still had limitations. Whenever Jonah worried he was not doing enough, Erin reassured him that Orion's body and mind needed time, something Jonah was more than willing to give. But as Orion improved, a quiet question arose in Jonah's thoughts. Would the horse ever be sound enough to handle real work, like pulling a small cart or helping herd the goats Jonah hoped to raise someday? He had not purchased Orion solely for farm labor, far from it, but the ability to share in daily tasks would give the horse a sense of purpose. Of that, Jonah felt sure. The question was whether it would be physically possible. One bright afternoon, Jonah decided to see how Orion reacted to a light harness. He had cobbled one together from old straps in the barn, hoping that familiarizing the horse with a basic setup might be a gentle introduction. He approached Orion slowly, running a hand over the horse's neck to reassure him. Then he draped the harness straps across Orion's back, letting them rest without tightening anything. Orion's ears went back, and for a moment he sidestepped anxiously, eyes showing the whites. Jonah quickly removed the harness and waited. After a minute of calm words and gentle stroking, he tried again, this time laying the harness over Orion's body for only a couple of seconds. Then he retreated, praising Orion for standing still. That was the entire session for the day. No force, no sudden moves. He would build from there. Some days, Orion surprised him by accepting new experiences with a quiet grace. Other days, any new stimulus seemed to bring back old fears. In those moments, the horse would break into a nervous sweat, his breath coming in frantic snorts. Jonah learned to read each signal, halting the session as soon as Orion showed signs of distress. He reminded himself that patience was the only path toward genuine trust. The calm, steady process carried on until one morning, quite unexpectedly, a fancy white sedan pulled into Jonah's driveway. Out stepped a tall, impeccably dressed man in sunglasses, clearly out of place in such rustic surroundings. Jonah immediately felt the knot of unease tightening in his stomach as he recognized the figure from the stud farm, one of the breeders who had scoffed at Jonah's truck and had jeered when he first took Orion home. The man introduced himself as Richard Lancaster. Though Jonah recognized him without needing the name, Lancaster gave the property a cursory glance, lips twitching with faint distaste at the peeling paint and muddy yard. "I'm here about that bay colt you purchased," Lancaster said, cutting straight to the point. "I've heard stories that he's making remarkable progress." His tone suggested skepticism rather than admiration. Jonah stiffened, crossing his arms. "Why does that matter to you?" he asked, trying to keep his voice even. Memories of the mocking laughter still stung like a fresh wound. Lancaster slid off his sunglasses and glanced around, as if searching for any sign of the horse. "I'm curious to see how he fared. Breeding is my passion, and I find it, let's say, intriguing that a horse with such a questionable background could be rehabilitated." "Perhaps I underestimated him." Jonah noted the slick confidence in Lancaster's posture. He led the man around the side of the barn, stopping at Orion's stall. The colt lifted his head, ears swiveling toward the unfamiliar visitor. Lancaster surveyed Orion for a long, silent moment, then pursed his lips. "He looks better than I expected," he conceded grudgingly. Despite his inherent distrust, Jonah felt a spark of pride rise within him at the grudging compliment. He just needed a little care, he said quietly. Lancaster slid his gaze back to Jonah, his expression betraying the unspoken question. Could a nobody like Jonah have truly achieved what more established breeders claimed was impossible? Finally, Lancaster cleared his throat. It seems I may have been too quick to judge, he said, speaking each word as if it cost him effort. Would you consider selling him now? I'm prepared to make you an offer, better than the pittance you paid. Jonah's heart thumped. A few months ago, he could barely scrape together enough to buy basic supplies. An influx of money might solve many of his farm's problems, might even grant him a chance to expand operations or fix the barn's leaky roof. The notion lasted only a second before he caught sight of Orion's solemn gaze. No sum of money could outweigh the bond they had forged. He met Lancaster's eyes evenly. He's not for sale, Jonah said, his voice firm. Orion stays with me. Lancaster's mouth tightened, and a flash of annoyance crossed his face. Silence fell, charged and heavy. Then the tall man exhaled sharply, placed his sunglasses back on, and inclined his head in a stiff nod. Very well, he said. Without another word, he strode off, leaving Jonah to watch him drive away in the spotless sedan. Jonah turned back to Orion and found the horse pawing at the ground as if unsettled by the stranger's presence. Jonah stepped into the stall, letting Orion sniff his palms before scratching behind the horse's ears. Don't worry, boy, he murmured, voice steady. I'm not giving you up for anything. In the bright afternoon sun, Orion pressed his muzzle to Jonah's shoulder, and Jonah felt a surge of reassurance. They had each other, and that was enough. Lancaster's departure left Jonah in a conflicted mood. On the one hand, he felt an undeniable surge of pride in refusing to sell Orion, preserving the fragile bond that had formed between them. On the other, his mind hummed with lingering doubts. Could he afford to maintain Orion's care if unforeseen costs arose? What if the horse's injuries flared up and required expensive treatment? Yet, Jonah told himself that no price tag could tempt him to part with the creature he had all but rescued from oblivion. Money was fleeting, but trust, once nurtured, felt far more valuable. The next morning, Jonah rose before dawn to check on Orion. A warm breeze drifted through the stable, carrying the scent of cut grass from the fields beyond. He found Orion standing quietly, dozing in the soft light. The moment Jonah approached, the horse lifted his head and took a step forward, ears flicking in a gentle greeting. That simple reaction drew a smile from Jonah. He reached out to stroke Orion's neck, murmuring words he hoped would convey how much the horse's presence meant to him. As if in reply, Orion bobbed his head, snorting softly. After completing his usual chores, feeding the chickens, inspecting the fences, and topping off the goat's water, Jonah returned to the stable. He gathered the items needed for the morning's light exercise session, a lead rope, a soft brush, and a few treats from Tom's wife. Orion observed with calm attention as Jonah entered the stall. The plan was to walk the length of the paddock, letting Orion stretch his legs and practice placing even weight on that weaker hind leg. The improvement was subtle but real. Each day, Orion's gait seemed a fraction smoother. They made slow, methodical circles near the fence line. Early sunlight glazed Orion's dark coat in a golden hue. Jonah found himself quietly marveling at how this once forsaken colt now carried himself with cautious dignity. Progress, though measured in small increments, became the heartbeat of their daily routine. Jonah used each positive step to counter any negative voices in his own head. Midway through their session, he noticed a pickup approaching along the gravel drive. Adjusting his straw hat, Jonah led Orion back toward the stable. A slender figure climbed out of the truck. Erin Summers, the veterinarian who had done so much to guide Orion's healing. She waved a friendly greeting. When she saw Orion walking alongside Jonah, she broke into a bright smile. "He's looking better every time I see him," Erin said, watching Orion's movements with a practiced eye. "I can almost see muscle forming in his hindquarters." She reached out to rub Orion's muzzle, and the horse accepted her touch without flinching. Jonah felt a swell of gratitude. "I can't thank you enough for all the advice," he said sincerely, recalling the first time Erin had examined Orion and listed the many hurdles ahead. "I wouldn't have known where to start if it wasn't for you." Erin's eyes shone with genuine warmth. "You're the one putting in the hours, Jonah. You've earned every bit of progress." She pulled a small jar from her bag, handing it over. "This is a salve that might help with the scarring. It can't erase everything, but it could soften the skin and ease any lingering irritation." Jonah thanked her, stowing the jar in the stable's feed room. He noticed that Erin seemed in no rush to leave, as though there was something else on her mind. "Sure enough," she cleared her throat softly, "I'm hosting a small gathering next week at my clinic," she explained, smiling at Jonah's questioning look. "It's for folks around here who've rescued horses or other animals. I was wondering if you might bring Orion, just for a little get-together, nothing fancy or stressful. It could be a good chance for him to interact with gentle people and see a new place." A pang of uncertainty gripped Jonah. He pictured Orion becoming anxious in an unfamiliar environment, but he also recognized the potential benefits. If Orion was ever to truly heal, he needed to encounter new faces and settings without relapsing into fear. And the clinic's gathering sounded like a supportive atmosphere, not a show ring or a competition. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded. "We can give it a try," he said, casting Orion a quick glance. "I'll do my best to keep him calm." Erin's face lit up. "I'm glad," she said. "I think you'll both find it encouraging." A handful of local folks have rescued everything from old racehorses to mistreated donkeys. It's a nice community. Once Erin left, Jonah mulled over the upcoming event. A quiet but insistent whisper of anxiety prickled at him. Orion still had triggers, and Jonah disliked the idea of exposing the horse to any kind of pressure. Yet he also knew that if Orion never ventured beyond the farm, he might remain captive to past trauma. The invitation felt like a necessary nudge toward growth. Over the following days, Jonah prepared in small, careful ways. He practiced loading Orion into the trailer he had patched up, turning what could have been a frightening experience into a slow, relaxed routine. The first attempt brought flashbacks of the day Jonah had brought Orion home, the colt stomping nervously, sweat lathering his flanks, fear visible in his eyes. But Jonah moved at Orion's pace, coaxing him with soft encouragement and gentle tugs, never forcing him up the ramp. Bit by bit, Orion's trembling decreased, and his snorts became less frantic. When Orion finally stood in the trailer with all four hooves steady, Jonah exhaled a relieved laugh. They stayed there for a few minutes, Jonah offering a treat now and then, before calmly backing out again. He repeated this routine each day, always ending on a positive note, until Orion stepped into the trailer with only mild hesitation. Jonah could hardly believe how far they had come since their first unsteady meeting in that fancy auction yard. Where once Orion's eyes had reflected pure terror, now they shone with a guarded but growing trust. Even so, Jonah knew that new environments might trigger old memories. He steeled himself for anything. At last, the day of Erin's gathering arrived, a sunny morning with a light breeze that rustled the tall grass around the farm. Jonah double-checked the trailer's latch and led Orion carefully up the ramp. The horse walked on, nervous but not panicked. In the cab of his truck, Jonah felt his heart flutter. He started the engine and headed toward Erin's clinic on the outskirts of town. The drive took them past rolling pastures and neat rows of corn, a reminder of the rural community that had shaped Jonah's life. At each turn, he cast a glance in the rearview mirror, imagining Orion's mindset. Soon enough, he spotted Erin's clinic, a modest property with several paddocks behind it and a small parking area where a few trucks and trailers were already parked. He swallowed hard, parking beside the other vehicles. Stepping out, Jonah noticed a gentle hum of conversation carrying from the clinic's open lawn. A handful of people mingled, some standing with their own rescued horses, others seated with rescued goats, sheep, or even dogs. It was a relaxed, welcoming scene, nothing like the tense auctions or fancy stud gatherings. That eased Jonah's nerves, but he still braced himself before opening the trailer door. Orion's ears were pricked straight forward, alert to the new scents and sounds. He let out a low snort, stamping once on the floor of the trailer. Jonah murmured reassurance, guiding the horse down the ramp. For a moment, Orion's legs trembled. Then he stepped onto the grass with Jonah leading the way. A chorus of mild chatter rippled through the crowd as they noticed Orion's arrival, several people smiling encouragingly or nodding in polite greeting. Erin hurried over, wearing a delighted grin. "You made it," she said, giving Orion a respectful nod. "He looks wonderful, Jonah." Her words calmed the tension in Jonah's shoulders. She showed them to a quieter corner of the paddock, where a few other horses were grazing. One of the owners, a middle-aged woman in a wide-brimmed sun hat, introduced herself as Carla. She spoke softly, explaining that her mare had once been rescued from a rodeo circuit. "She was terrified of ropes," Carla confided. "It took months before she'd let me lift a halter over her ears. Now we trail ride together every weekend." Jonah listened, touched by how many stories mirrored his own experiences with Orion. After all, each of these animals had their own scars, physical or emotional, and each person here had chosen compassion over convenience. He patted Orion's neck, watching as Carla's mare ambled closer to investigate. Orion's ears flattened warily, but Jonah gave him space to retreat if needed. Instead, Orion stiffened only for a moment before lowering his head to sniff the mare's muzzle. The two horses stood nose to nose, exchanging quiet acknowledgements. Relief flooded Jonah. The connection Orion found with another rescued horse felt like proof that healing could extend beyond just their little farm. Soon, Carla's mare wandered off to graze, and Orion remained at Jonah's side, eyes more curious than afraid. Erin returned with a shallow pan of water, offering it to Orion in case he needed a drink. He drank a little, never fully dropping his guard, yet never panicking either. Throughout the morning, a few more folks ambled over. One had a yearling donkey who leaned against her knees, seeking scratches behind its ears. Another had a retired thoroughbred with a crooked leg, rescued from a racing stable that planned to send him off for slaughter. Each conversation Jonah joined deepened his appreciation for the quiet heroism around him. It wasn't about big gestures or grand victories. It was about daily acts of care, the slow work of restoring life to those written off as broken. When noon arrived, Erin invited everyone to a simple potluck near the clinic's porch. Jonah tied Orion in a shady spot beside Carla's mare, giving them both space while the humans ate. He kept an eye on Orion, half expecting the horse to spook at some sudden movement or burst of laughter, but Orion only swished his tail, occasionally shifting his weight or sniffing at the nearby mare. The afternoon sunlight revealed new hints of shine in his once dull coat. Jonah's heart warmed at the sight. An hour later, as people began to pack up and head out, Erin approached Jonah, her gaze full of admiration. "That was an incredible step for him," she said, voice low. "I'd say Orion did better than we could have hoped." Jonah glanced at his horse, who turned his head in their direction as if curious about the conversation. "I think he surprised even himself," Jonah replied, lips curving into a soft smile. He couldn't help but recall Lancaster's offer to buy Orion. This was what Lancaster could never understand: the intangible worth of a creature who had found trust again. Thanking Erin and Carla for their support, Jonah led Orion back into the trailer. The horse's hesitation lasted a fraction of a second, replaced by cautious acceptance as they loaded up for home. On the drive back, Jonah felt lighter than he had in a long time. Maybe they had a steep road still ahead, health setbacks, financial concerns, and the lingering question of what Orion's full capabilities might be. But with each gentle triumph, Jonah felt the edges of that road grow a little clearer. The once ridiculed farmhand and the cast-off colt were forging a path together, bound by quiet determination and the promise of a kinder future. When Jonah guided the truck back onto his farm after Erin's gathering, he could still feel a sense of elation radiating through him. The event had been small and unassuming, but for Orion, it had been a milestone of trust and composure. Jonah parked near the stable, hopped out, and lowered the trailer's ramp. As always, he made sure to move calmly, offering soft reassurance to the bay colt inside. Orion stepped onto the familiar gravel yard with just a single nervous toss of his head. Dawn had turned to dusk by the time Jonah led Orion into his stall, but a glow of optimism lingered. Not so long ago, he never would have imagined that Orion could settle so well among strangers. Jonah spent the following day immersed in repairs around the property, pausing every now and then to gauge Orion's mood. The horse seemed more relaxed than ever, occasionally poking his head over the stall door to watch Jonah hammer a loose board or refill the goat's trough. Each time Jonah glanced over, Orion's ears were up, his eyes bright. It was as though the small triumph at Erin's clinic had unlocked a bit more confidence. In the afternoon, Jonah carefully saddled Orion with a lightweight pad, testing how he might react to pressure across his back. Though Orion tensed for a moment, he did not rear or bolt, and Jonah praised him lavishly for his composure. Encouraged by these small breakthroughs, Jonah devised a simple training regimen. Each morning, he would lead Orion on walks around the pasture, focusing on lengthening the horse's stride and building muscle in the weaker hind leg. After lunch, he would spend 15 minutes working on saddle familiarization, never pushing Orion past his comfort zone. In the evenings, he groomed the colt thoroughly, marveling at how the dull coat of old had taken on a healthier shine. The process became a quiet ritual, one that deepened the trust between them. Though they were far from any grand goals, like pulling carts or cantering freely without a limp, Jonah could see that Orion's spirit grew stronger each day. Financial worries still gnawed at Jonah. He had poured most of his savings into Orion's feed, supplements, and occasional veterinary consultations. His farm income was modest, and the drought that year had made his crops yield less than usual. One afternoon, as he flicked through his meager accounts, a wave of panic threatened to surface. Did he dare look for a second job in town? Should he sell off a section of land to ease the burden? Each possibility weighed on him, but none more so than the fear of failing Orion. However tight money became, Jonah refused to cut corners on the horse's care. Orion had shown him too much heart to be neglected again. One evening, Tom swung by to drop off a small sack of oats he had picked up at the feed store. Spotting Jonah's worry, he asked what was wrong. Reluctantly, Jonah admitted that finances were growing precarious. Tom nodded sympathetically. "You know," he said slowly, "there's a local fair coming up. They usually hold a horse showcase to raise funds for our region's rescue organizations. Maybe you and Orion could take part." Jonah blinked in surprise. A showcase. I'm not looking to show him off. He's not that kind of horse. Tom shrugged gently. Might just be a way to share his story. And, well, sometimes they offer small cash prizes. Could help both you and Orion. Jonah's first instinct was to refuse. Orion might not handle the noise and excitement of a fair, and Jonah despised the idea of parading him around like a spectacle. But Tom's suggestion sat in his mind, mingling with the memory of how well Orion had managed at Erin's gathering. That event, though small, had shown that Orion could handle a gentle crowd if prepared properly, and if a bit of prize money could ease the strain on Jonah's budget, maybe it was worth considering. Late into the night, he weighed the pros and cons. Finally, as dawn approached, Jonah decided to at least learn more about the fair before making a choice. A few days later, he drove to the town hall where fair organizers were finalizing the event schedule. The local fair, it turned out, was less about glitz and more about community. Pie contests, petting zoos, musical performances, and, yes, a small horse showcase. The organizer, a kind-faced woman named Beth, explained that rescue or rehabilitated horses were especially encouraged to participate. We're trying to highlight the stories of animals who found a second chance, Beth said. There's a modest award for the top 3 in showmanship, but mostly it's about celebrating these bonds. Jonah found himself slowly warming to the idea. Maybe it wasn't about parading Orion's scars, but sharing the resilience they represented. Returning home, Jonah gave Orion a thoughtful pat along the withers. There was no denying Orion had come a long way, but crowds and loudspeakers might still unnerve him. Over the next few weeks, Jonah introduced new stimuli in small doses. He played recordings of fair noises, a distant band, the chatter of a crowd, and observed Orion's reactions. Whenever the horse showed signs of anxiety, Jonah would speak softly and offer a reassuring touch. Gradually, the tension in Orion's body eased, though it never disappeared entirely. Meanwhile, Jonah practiced basic showmanship cues. He guided Orion to stand calmly, turn in place, and walk with measured grace at Jonah's side. Nothing fancy, just enough to demonstrate the connection they had forged. When the fair weekend finally arrived, Jonah felt nerves jangling in his stomach. He woke early to groom Orion meticulously, brushing out every tangle and wiping down the horse's hooves. Orion seemed calm, though he occasionally blew out a tremulous breath. Jonah loaded him into the trailer, double-checking each latch as a swirl of tension prickled his thoughts. During the drive, he tried to banish memories of the mocking stares at the luxury stud farm, reminding himself that this was a different crowd, a neighborly gathering of everyday people. Upon arriving at the fairgrounds, Jonah spotted a ring set up on a grassy stretch beside bright carnival booths. Families wandered about, clutches of children giggling and pointing at the array of animals. Jonah parked, took a moment to steady himself, then gently eased Orion out of the trailer. The horse lifted his head high, ears swiveling to absorb the new symphony of sounds. Laughter, distant music, even the bleating of goats from a petting area. For a moment, Orion's eyes went wide, but Jonah laid a hand on the colt's neck, speaking in the same soft tone he always used. They found a quiet spot near the ring where other participants were preparing. A friendly volunteer handed Jonah a number tag, explaining how the showcase would proceed. All the while, Orion sniffed the air, occasionally backing away from a sudden noise but never losing control. Jonah took that as an encouraging sign. When the showcase began, Jonah led Orion into the ring with steady steps, heart pounding. A small crowd ringed the perimeter, applauding politely for each entrant. Orion's ears flicked at the scattered clapping, but he held his composure, staying close to Jonah's side. They performed simple maneuvers, walking in a straight line, halting on cue, turning gently in place. Jonah glanced into Orion's eyes and saw not the old fear, but a quiet determination. In those moments, it mattered little whether they won a ribbon. The true victory shone in Orion's calm acceptance of the crowd and Jonah's unwavering support at his side. By the time they exited, Jonah felt tears prickling his eyes, overwhelmed by gratitude for how far they'd come. He smiled, unashamed and proud. After Jonah exited the ring, applause followed him like a gentle wave, mingling with the swirl of sweet fairground aromas. He stroked Orion's neck, guiding the colt toward a corner of the enclosure where participants waited their turn. A few curious onlookers stepped forward with kind words or soft questions about Orion's history, and Jonah answered them with a quiet humility that matched the horse's subdued grace. One older gentleman patted Jonah on the shoulder, remarking that it was rare to see such a trusting bond between man and horse, especially given the scars Orion bore. Jonah, blushing under the praise, offered a modest smile. He admitted that it had taken months of patience, plus help from a few friends, to coax Orion out of his shell. The older man nodded wisely, then drifted away, leaving Jonah with a renewed sense of gratitude for the journey they shared. Jonah lingered near the warm-up area, watching other rescued horses make their rounds. A pint-sized mare that had once been starved trotted by, her glossy coat now shining under the midday sun. Nearby, a tall gelding with a crooked blaze nuzzled a nervous young handler. Everywhere, Jonah saw quiet triumphs, small stories of perseverance written in every pair of hooves. Orion stood calmly, ears flicking at the occasional burst of laughter or applause. The swirl of color and sound did not overwhelm him, as Jonah once feared it would. Instead, Orion seemed to accept the fairground's bustle like a gentle breeze, an echo of the trust they had painstakingly built. Pride blossomed in Jonah's chest. He whispered another word of gratitude into Orion's ear and felt the horse shift closer, as if to say that they were in this together, no matter what came next. With the showcase wrapped up, the announcer asked participants to gather near a small stage at the far end of the ring. Jonah led Orion there, standing alongside men and women whose weathered faces spoke of countless hours spent caring for animals once deemed hopeless. A panel of local judges, all wearing big smiles, offered each participant a handshake and a word of thanks. They began announcing special awards like Best Turnaround and Gentlest Giant. Jonah stroked Orion's neck, not expecting any accolades. Just being there was reward enough for him. Then, to his astonishment, they called his name for the Inspiring Partnership ribbon. Jonah smiled quietly as he stepped forward to accept a small rosette and a certificate. Applause washed over him, and he felt no trace of self-consciousness. Orion had indeed become more than a rescued horse. He was a beacon of hope. After the ceremony, Jonah found himself approached by a short, energetic woman wearing a volunteer badge. She introduced herself as Karen and explained that she ran a small local newspaper. "Your story is exactly what our readers love," she enthused, eyes gleaming. "Could I interview you and snap a picture for next week's feature?" Jonah shifted awkwardly, unaccustomed to attention. Glancing at Orion, he hesitated. Would the flash spook him? Karen noticed his concern and assured him that she could photograph them outdoors with natural light, no sudden bursts. Reluctantly, Jonah agreed, figuring that if it might inspire others to rescue animals, may be worth swallowing his discomfort. Karen's questions were gentle, focusing on how Orion had changed Jonah's life and how the bond they shared gave them both new purpose. By the time they finished, Orion stood quietly behind Jonah, calm beneath the lens of Karen's camera. Leaving the fair, Jonah felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. He had never been one for public attention, yet hearing applause for Orion's progress had filled him with genuine pride. As he drove back to the farm, he kept replaying the moment they received that ribbon, the weight of it, a tangible reminder that dedication could bear fruit in unexpected ways. Once home, Jonah led Orion into his stall and removed the halter, letting the colt roll in fresh straw. Orion snorted and pawed happily, as though relieved to be free from the day's excitement. Jonah patted his shoulder and mumbled, "You earned a good rest, boy." Turning away, he spotted the new rosette pinned to his jacket pocket and felt his throat tighten. It wasn't just a symbol of their journey, it was proof that resilience could outshine even the most daunting odds. That night, Jonah sat on the porch, staring at the stars. A gentle breeze rustled the old oak trees framing his property, and the sounds of distant crickets filled the air. He ran his fingers over the rosette pinned beside him, remembering every setback and moment of doubt he'd battled since bringing Orion home. Behind him, dim light spilled from the stable, where Orion dozed in peaceful comfort. Jonah couldn't help wondering what his father would say if he were still around. Perhaps he'd chuckle at the idea that a so-called useless horse had taken them this far. The thought brought a sad smile to Jonah's lips. In his father's absence, Jonah had often felt unsure, but Orion's triumphs served as a guiding light. Closing his eyes, Jonah breathed deeply, letting the night's hush cradle him in quiet, still optimism for whatever challenges lay ahead. Morning arrived with a warm glow, and Jonah ventured into the stable to find Orion alert and nuzzling the stall door. After a quick grooming session, Jonah decided to try something new, a brief ride. Though Orion's leg remained somewhat delicate, Aaron had suggested that careful mounting could help strengthen his muscles if done gently. Jonah slipped a lightweight saddle onto Orion's back, then led him into the paddock. He paused, heart thudding in his chest as he tested the stirrup. Orion shifted uneasily, ears flicking back. Jonah murmured calming words and, with the utmost caution, swung a leg over to settle lightly into the saddle. For a few tense seconds, Orion stood rigid, nostrils flaring. Then, as Jonah breathed calmly and stroked his neck, the horse relaxed. Step by halting step, they moved together under the rising sun, forging yet another fragile step forward. Over the next few weeks, Jonah kept these riding sessions short, never pushing Orion beyond a few laps at a slow walk. Each time, the horse showed flashes of uncertainty, but he trusted Jonah's guiding hand enough to keep going. Erin visited to watch their progress, offering tips on posture and pacing. She was pleased by Orion's newfound steadiness, pointing out that though his limp would likely remain, it didn't have to prevent him from living a fulfilling life. Encouraged, Jonah jotted down simple goals in a notebook. Walk around the entire pasture without hesitation, practice smooth mounting and dismounting, and gradually introduce a gentle trot if Orion felt ready. Those ambitions felt monumental in the context of Orion's past. Yet each accomplished milestone stood as living proof that a discarded horse could rise above old injuries, forging a path nobody else had believed possible. But progress never followed a perfectly upward line. One morning, Orion spooked at a fluttering tarp near the barn, bolting so abruptly that Jonah lost his grip on the lead. The horse careened across the yard, eyes wild with old terror. It took nearly an hour to coax Orion back to safety, and when Jonah finally guided him into the stall, the colt trembled uncontrollably. All the old fears threatened to resurface in Jonah's mind as well, conjuring images of shattered trust and backslides. Yet as he stood with Orion, hand placed gently over the horse's heaving flank, Jonah refused to surrender to despair. He reminded himself that setbacks were part of any healing journey. By evening, Orion had let Jonah approach again, leaning into his touch with a hesitant but undeniable willingness to try once more. When Orion finally calmed in his stall after that frightening bolt, Jonah leaned his forehead against the stable door, relief mingling with exhaustion. He could still feel the thunder of Orion's hooves echoing in his memory, as if it were a warning that no journey toward healing was truly finished. Outside, dusk crept across the farm, the sky painted with streaks of pink and orange. Jonah wondered whether this setback would unravel their progress, returning Orion to the skittish horse he'd been at the start. Yet as the night settled, the horse's trembling eased, and when Jonah softly called his name, Orion moved closer, resting his head against Jonah's outstretched hand. In that small gesture, Jonah found enough hope to keep going. Over the next few days, Jonah maintained extra caution. He double-checked the barnyard for any loose materials that might flap unexpectedly in the breeze, mindful that Orion's fears could flare at the slightest provocation. The old tarp was folded and stored away, replaced by sturdy canvas that didn't crackle as loudly. Each morning, Jonah studied Orion's eyes for lingering anxiety, but the horse seemed willing enough to continue their gentle routine. A brisk walk around the pasture remained the focus of their training, reintroducing the calm that Orion had known before the incident. Erin dropped by to assess Orion's muscles, reassuring Jonah that the horse hadn't sustained any new injuries. One evening, after Jonah finished the day's chores, he climbed the fence beside Orion's paddock, letting the summer air settle on his skin. Fireflies glimmered like tiny lanterns, and Orion grazed peacefully a few yards away. As Jonah watched the horse sway through the tall grass, he felt a tug of emotion. He recalled how just a short while back, Orion's entire existence had been bound by fear. Fear of humans, fear of touch, fear that no place was safe. Now, the sight of Orion grazing in half-lit serenity showed how far they had come, even if uncertainty still lurked at the edges. A few days later, a visitor arrived, pulling up in a battered truck that wore dust like a badge of hard work. Out stepped Bill Mosley, an old acquaintance of Jonah's father. Tall and broad-shouldered, Bill had the rugged air of a man who had seen decades of farm life. Jonah welcomed him warmly, recalling times when Bill had helped bale hay for Jonah's family in years past. After exchanging pleasantries, Bill cast a curious glance at Orion, who stood with pricked ears in the paddock. "Word travels," Bill said in his gravelly voice. "Heard you've got yourself a rescue horse here, one that nobody else believed in." His eyes flicked over Orion's frame, noting the faint limp and the old scar. "He's got a way about him, don't he?" Jonah nodded, explaining briefly how Orion had been labeled worthless at a stud farm, how he had struggled with injuries and deep-seated fears. Bill listened intently, then gave an approving grunt. "I've been around plenty of horses," he said, "but some of the best I've known came from places where folks had all but given up on them. If you ever need an extra hand, or if you want to try introducing him to some low-stress herding, let me know. My ranch isn't far." Intrigued by the idea, Jonah wondered if Orion might one day be confident enough to help with basic herding tasks. It was a vision he'd long imagined, a once-forgotten horse trotting steadily behind goats or cattle, proud to be doing honest work. For now, though, it felt premature. Orion's emotional well-being still required gentle handling, and Jonah intended to respect that pace, yet Bill's offer stayed in his mind, nudging him toward a bigger picture of Orion's potential. As the weeks pressed on, small transformations continued to mark their days. Orion showed less apprehension when Jonah introduced the saddle, and although they remained limited to short, easy rides, the horse no longer froze at the feel of weight on his back. Erin supervised one such ride, noting how Orion's gait, though imperfect, had improved enough to support occasional slow trots. Jonah's heart soared each time he felt that tentative transition from walk to trot, even if it lasted just a few strides. During those moments, Horse and rider seemed fused by an understanding that overcame past wounds. Eager to ensure that Orion would not be spooked by unexpected visitors, Jonah sometimes invited Tom or Carla, the woman he'd met at Erin's gathering, to drop by unannounced, walking around the yard or calling out greetings. Orion's ears would swivel, his body alert, yet he rarely panicked in the ways he once had. Jonah rewarded these calm reactions with gentle pats or treats, further reinforcing the idea that strangers need not represent danger. The memory of Orion's frantic bolt remained fresh, but each successful encounter felt like a step away from that fragile night. One late afternoon, as Jonah brushed Orion down, he heard the rumble of an approaching vehicle. Stepping outside the stable, he recognized the sleek sedan that had visited once before, Richard Lancaster's. Jonah's jaw tightened. He recalled the man's earlier offer to buy Orion, which Jonah had swiftly refused. Lancaster emerged, dressed impeccably as always, his posture exuding a confidence that bordered on arrogance. "Good day, Jonah," Lancaster said, scanning the farm with mild distaste. "I was in the area and thought to check on that bay colt again. I've heard talk around town. Apparently, you took him to a fair. People were impressed." Jonah gave a short nod, his tone carefully polite. Orion's making good progress. He wondered what Lancaster truly wanted. The man's gaze shifted to the paddock, where Orion stood with ears pricked at the sight of a newcomer. "Indeed," Lancaster murmured. "He seems far less skittish than before." He paused, as though weighing his next words. "I take it you still have no interest in selling him." Jonah's shoulders stiffened. "That hasn't changed," he said. Lancaster pushed out a slow breath, as if frustrated by Jonah's unwavering stance. "You might want to reconsider," he ventured, a practiced smoothness to his tone. "I'm prepared to offer even more than before. You've proven the horse's potential. I could elevate him further with proper resources." A flash of protectiveness coursed through Jonah. He glanced at Orion, who had approached the fence, sniffing curiously in Lancaster's direction. "I appreciate your interest," Jonah replied, careful to keep his anger in check. "But Orion is doing just fine here. No amount of money can replace the bond we share." Lancaster seemed poised to argue, then caught the resolute look in Jonah's eyes. A faint sneer curled his lips. "Suit yourself," he said curtly. "I suppose sentiment outweighs practicality for some." Without waiting for further discussion, he spun on his heel, returned to the sedan, and drove off in a swirl of dust. Jonah let out a tense sigh, walking to Orion's side and rubbing his muzzle. "Don't worry, boy," he muttered. "He's not taking you anywhere." Orion pressed into Jonah's hand, the horse's soft breath a reassuring warmth against Jonah's fingers. Inside, Jonah felt a surge of gratitude for this animal that some regarded as worthless. No matter how challenging finances became or how many snide remarks he endured, he refused to measure Orion's worth by a price tag. Shortly after Lancaster's departure, Jonah decided it was time for a quiet ride to clear his head. The evening sun cast a gentle glow across the pasture as Jonah readied Orion's tack. After double-checking the cinch and giving Orion a moment to settle, Jonah swung into the saddle. They started at a slow walk, the dryness of late summer rustling through the grass. Jonah guided Orion around the outer fence line, finding a comfort in the rhythmic footfalls. His mind drifted to Bill's suggestion about herding, imagining how Orion might one day trot out among goats or sheep, leaning gently into turns, responding to subtle cues. The picture felt both distant and quietly thrilling. It represented a normalcy that once seemed impossible, a future where Orion could do meaningful farm tasks without fear. Lost in thought, Jonah nearly missed the telltale stutter in Orion's step as they neared the far corner of the pasture. A cluster of crows erupted from the grass, startling them both. Orion jerked sideways, muscles tensing, and Jonah braced himself. Heart pounding, he murmured the calm words he'd used so many times before. Orion danced sideways a few steps, but then, in a moment of newfound control, he halted. Jonah patted his neck, feeling the thunder of Orion's pulse beneath the saddle. Yet the horse did not bolt. After a few quivering breaths, Orion lowered his head, snorting out tension. A wave of gratitude washed over Jonah. The spook could have escalated into a full-blown panic, but Orion managed to hold steady. Slowly, Jonah guided him forward again. They skirted the corner, passing the spot where the crows had burst into the sky. And this time, Orion only gave a wary glance. As they rounded back toward the stable, Jonah realized his hands trembled slightly on the reins, though his chest brimmed with pride. At the stable, he dismounted, removing the saddle with care and leading Orion into his stall. "Good job," he murmured, offering an oat treat. Orion's ears flicked contentedly, and Jonah felt a surge of hope that overshadowed the lingering tension of the day. Inside him glowed the knowledge that while not every spook could be prevented, Orion was learning to handle fear in smaller, more measured doses. That night, Jonah wrestled with sleep, thoughts swirling about Lancaster's visit and the uncertain financial future of his farm. Yet each time worry threatened to keep him awake. He pictured Orion remaining calm amid the crows and felt a gentle reassurance flood back in. The day had shown him that progress remained possible, even in the face of fear. They might never be free of challenges, but together they had something far stronger than money or prestige. They had a bond shaped by patience, trust, and the shared triumph of each small step forward. Night returned to Jonah's farm with an air of expectant stillness, as if the land itself waited for some quiet revelation to unfold. Jonah stood by Orion's paddock, listening to the soft shuffle of hooves against the packed earth. Though exhaustion tugged at his limbs from a day of labor, he lingered in the hush. The stars above glimmered in the velvety sky, and a distant owl hooted in the surrounding woods. Each rustle of wind in the grass reminded Jonah that peace could be fragile. Yet in that moment, Orion grazed contentedly, his silhouette a testament to resilience and trust. By morning, Jonah had thrown himself into a rigorous routine. He woke before dawn, fed the chickens and goats, then checked Orion's stall to ensure the colt had rested well. Over coffee, Jonah scribbled notes about training exercises he planned to attempt, especially short trot sessions that might further strengthen Orion's hind leg. The memory of Lancaster's recent visit still gnawed at him, a reminder that some people viewed Orion as a commodity to be bought and sold. Jonah countered those thoughts by remembering how the horse had stood his ground after the crows erupted from the field. If Orion could control his panic once, he could do it again. That afternoon, Jonah led Orion to the pasture's southern side, where the grass had grown high enough to sway in the breeze. He introduced a series of gentle obstacles, small logs to step over, a few poles laid out in a curve, and a cone marking a tight turn. Each item was new to Orion, and the colt eyed them with caution. Jonah stayed patient, guiding Orion with a calm voice. At first, Orion balked at the logs, ears flattening briefly. Yet Jonah's steady presence coaxed the horse forward. Step by tremulous step, Orion navigated the improvised course, muzzle quivering as he sniffed each unfamiliar object. By the end, Jonah could feel Orion's heart still hammering, but no bolt came. Erin stopped by later that same day. She'd finished her morning rounds and brought along a portable scale to check Orion's weight gain. Together, they coaxed the colt onto a makeshift platform, rewarding him with a treat each time he placed a hoof correctly. When the reading finally appeared, Erin broke into a grin. Orion had added a healthy amount of muscle, confirming what Jonah had seen in the colt's steady strides. "You're doing wonderfully," Erin said, her tone warm. "Keep up the mix of light exercise and rest. That leg still needs care, but his overall condition has improved dramatically." With Erin's encouragement, Jonah decided to push a bit farther. He saddled Orion for another short ride, leading him to the farthest edge of the property where dense shrubbery marked the boundary line. The terrain was unfamiliar for Orion, teeming with hidden rustles and sudden bursts of birds. Jonah's pulse quickened each time a thrush flitted out of the undergrowth. Yet Orion never lost his composure entirely. He startled, but listened to Jonah's guiding cues. They wove carefully through clusters of wildflowers and turned back only when the sky began to deepen into late afternoon hues. Once home, Orion snorted with relief, but Jonah sensed the pride in the horse's bearing. They'd ventured farther than ever, facing the unknown together. A week later, Bill Mosley's invitation to practice low-key herding rolled back into Jonah's mind. Jonah mulled over the idea, realizing that exposing Orion to gentle livestock work might provide a sense of purpose. He swallowed his lingering worry and phoned Bill, asking if the man's offer still stood. Bill responded with enthusiasm, suggesting they start with a small group of docile goats at his ranch. Though Jonah felt a swirl of nerves, he also recognized that challenging Orion in a controlled setting could bolster the colt's confidence. They agreed to meet 2 days later, once Jonah had finished essential tasks on his own farm. When the day arrived, Jonah loaded Orion into the trailer, double-checked the latches, and set out for Bill's place. The short drive wound through rolling hills dotted with grazing cattle. Orion stomped a few times inside the trailer, but Jonah reassured himself that the colt had braved trips before. At Bill's ranch, the landscape opened into wide pastures, neatly fenced paddocks, and a large barn that shone with recent repairs. Bill, wearing a welcoming grin, waved Jonah over to a smaller enclosure where half a dozen goats ambled around. Each goat looked relaxed, accustomed to humans. Jonah unloaded Orion, patting his neck and letting the horse adapt to this new environment. Though Orion's eyes roved anxiously over the goats, he didn't shy away from Bill's presence. After some introductions, Bill explained that they would start by letting Orion walk at a safe distance behind the goats, guiding them along a short path. The goats, Bill assured Jonah, were calm creatures who barely flinched even when bigger animals approached. Jonah nodded, mounting carefully. Orion shifted under him, but Bill's confident demeanor seemed to put the horse at ease. They began with a slow approach. Bill clucked at the goats, who meandered forward. Jonah, on Orion's back, followed at a leisurely pace. At first, Orion's ears flicked back and forth with uncertainty. The goat's quick, zigzag motions startled him into halting once or twice, but each time Jonah coaxed him onward with a gentle press of his legs. Soon, Orion found a rhythm, stepping carefully behind the goats without crowding them. Bill watched, nodding approvingly. When a young goat suddenly scampered sideways, Orion startled, but Jonah gave him space and steadied the reins. Instead of bolting, the horse merely jerked in place and resumed his walk. Jonah exhaled a grateful breath. After a few laps around the enclosure, Bill motioned for them to stop. Jonah dismounted and led Orion to a corner post. The horse's sides quivered, damp with sweat. Bill approached, offering Jonah a nod and a broad smile. "He's got the heart for it," Bill said. "Still skittish, sure, but you've done wonders with him. In time, he might even help you move livestock on your own land." Jonah felt a swell of gratitude for the acknowledgement. They agreed to end on a positive note, not wanting to overtax Orion's limits. Bill even placed a friendly hand on the colt's shoulder, murmuring praise, and Orion tolerated the touch. Back home, Jonah gave Orion a thorough brushing, humming in the late afternoon quiet. Images of Orion calmly trailing goats replayed in his mind. The colt had wavered between nerves and curiosity, but he'd never succumbed to full-blown panic. To Jonah, that symbolized not just progress, but a future full of possibilities. He thought of Lancaster's dismissive attitude once more. How could that man even fathom the value of these small steps, each one earned by mutual respect? As dusk arrived, Jonah climbed up to the hayloft with a mind to tidy the bales. He found himself pausing now and again, gazing through the loft's open window at Orion in the paddock below. The horse idly swished his tail, occasionally lifting his head to scan the horizon. Jonah wondered if Orion felt as if he'd come home. The question sparked a longing inside Jonah, a wish that both he and Orion would always find steadiness in each other, no matter what storms might loom. Late that night, Jonah sat on the worn wooden porch, the old boards creaking under his weight. The night sky shimmered overhead, and his thoughts drifted from Bill's ranch to the uncertain finances that still shadowed his days. But in that darkness, hope shone brighter than worry. Each step with Orion, from the first hesitant brush to this new venture in herding, had shown Jonah that healing took time, yet was within reach. Maybe he couldn't stop taxes or drought, but he could stand by this horse he'd rescued from abandonment. Then, a rustling sound broke the silence. Jonah looked up to see a figure approaching, Tom, lantern in hand. "Sorry to drop by so late," Tom said softly, "but I wanted to give you something." He set down a small box on the porch table. Inside, Jonah found a brand new bridle, polished and carefully stitched. Tom explained that a local tack shop owner had heard about Orion's story and donated it, asking only that Jonah put it to good use. Jonah felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes as he ran his fingers over the smooth leather. The kindness of his neighbors reminded him that even in hard times, community could lift them both. After Tom departed, Jonah carried the bridle into the stable. Orion peered over the stall door, ears swiveling in curiosity. With gentle strokes, Jonah let the colt sniff the new leather. The horse's nostrils flared, and for an instant, Jonah remembered the callous sneers from the stud farm. There, Orion had been valued only by numbers and prospects. Here, among neighbors and friends, he was cherished for his spirit. Jonah hung the bridle on a peg and patted Orion's neck. "We've got a good world here," he whispered. "I'll make sure you stay part of it." He dimmed the lantern and walked outside, heart full. Tomorrow would bring more chores, more training, and likely more challenges. Yet the promise of Orion's potential and the unwavering support of those who believed in them carried Jonah through any lingering fears. The house stood quiet under the moonlight, but the stable glowed softly with the warmth of a life reclaimed, one that no one would ever again deem worthless. Dawn broke over Jonah's farm with a restless hush, as though the land were holding its breath for whatever lay ahead. Though the early morning sky glowed pale, storm clouds threatened on the horizon, suggesting the possibility of rain. Jonah took note of the gathering clouds as he stepped outside, inhaling the crisp air and closing his eyes to focus on his day's plan. First, he would check on Orion, whose stall had become a sanctuary of quiet progress. Then, he planned to haul feed for the goats, repair a sagging fence post near the orchard, and possibly prepare the small corral for another training session. Even with the threat of a storm, a sense of steady determination tugged Jonah onward, and in the center of it all, Orion had become more than a rescued horse. He was a symbol of renewal. Morning chores flowed smoothly, the routine comforting in its familiarity. Jonah tended the goats first, distributing fresh feed and marveling at how they scurried around his feet with playful energy. Next, he visited Orion's stall, where the bay colt greeted him with a gentle whicker. Jonah ran a practiced eye over Orion's coat, noticing the healthy sheen that had replaced the dullness from so many months ago. There was still a faint scar near Orion's flank, but the tissue had softened thanks to Erin's salve. As Jonah filled the water bucket, he whispered words of encouragement to Orion, promising a new round of exercises if the weather held. The horse nodded as though he understood, a quiet acceptance shining in his eyes. Such moments reassured Jonah that all his sacrifices, financial strain, endless hours of training, and the occasional heartbreak had been worth it. By midday, a light drizzle began, tapping gently on the barn's metal roof. Jonah busied himself patching up a gap in the orchard fence, aware that heavier rain might soon turn the soil to mud. Overhead, grey clouds layered themselves across the sky, dimming the daylight until everything looked subdued and hushed. In the stable, Orion snorted at the change in pressure, occasionally pacing in his stall. Jonah checked on him frequently, offering reassurance through voice and gentle touch. The horse seemed uneasy, as if the shifting atmosphere brought echoes of older fears. Jonah set up a few simple poles in the covered arena to give Orion something constructive to focus on. Leading the colt there, he guided him through a basic obstacle pattern, praising every calm step. Even with rain spattering on the overhead tin, Orion stayed composed enough to follow Jonah's cues. Late in the afternoon, the drizzle grew into a steady rain, drumming against the farm's roofs and saturating the earth. Jonah led Orion back to the stable, giving the colt a vigorous rub-down to dry his coat. Thunder rumbled in the distance, causing Orion to shift nervously, but he soon settled under Jonah's calming presence. With the storm growing louder, Jonah considered it wise to spend a few hours indoors, catching up on bookkeeping instead. Money remained tight, and though he had made modest gains selling produce at the local market, the old barn still needed repairs, and winter feed costs loomed. As raindrops beat against the windows of his small home, Jonah jotted figures in a worn ledger. Each row reminded him that if not for Orion's progress, he might have accepted Lancaster's offer out of desperation. But every time he pictured the horse's trusting eyes, Jonah reaffirmed his commitment. Orion wasn't going anywhere. In the thick of the storm, lightning flashed over distant fields, illuminating the sky in brief, bright pulses. Jonah stepped outside with a lantern when he noticed the goats had huddled near a corner of their pen, bleating anxiously. He coaxed them back under their shelter, tossing extra hay to keep them calm. A gust of wind lashed at the trees, sending a loose branch tumbling across the yard. Jonah's heart raced as he ran to secure the barn doors, half expecting Orion to panic at the tumult. Yet, when he peered into the stable, Orion merely flicked his ears, shifting restlessly but not frantically. Grateful for the horse's composure, Jonah whispered a few soothing words before returning to check on a leaky gutter along the side of the house. The storm felt relentless, and as the sky cracked with thunder, Jonah was reminded yet again that progress could hold firm in the face of chaos. Eventually, the storm began to wane, leaving the fields soaked and the air heavy with the scent of wet earth. Jonah poured himself a mug of coffee, sipping it by the window as dawn lightened the eastern horizon. The farm looked battered but intact. Branches littered the yard, and puddles formed in every dip of land. Once the sun rose enough to see clearly, Jonah made his rounds. He collected fallen debris, checked on the goats again, and saved Orion's stall for last. The colt greeted him with a tired nicker, as though the night's tension had worn both of them thin. Jonah inspected Orion's legs for any sign of injury. Satisfied, he offered a few carrots and a quiet word of praise. The storm had tested them, but the bond they shared had emerged stronger for it. Outside, the early sun broke through ragged clouds, promising a fresh day of rebuilding. Later that week, with the fields drying out, Bill Moseley stopped by unannounced. He found Jonah mending a fractured fence post near the orchard, where the storm had snapped a limb clean off a tree. Bill offered a hand, and together they hoisted new boards into place, hammering them securely. As they worked, Bill mentioned he had a small group of docile cattle that might be even easier for Orion to practice herding. Jonah hesitated. Though Orion had shown promise with goats, cattle were larger, potentially more intimidating. Yet Bill's gentle coaching had helped Orion grow. Jonah weighed his options, recalling how each new challenge had strengthened their bond. At last, he nodded with cautious optimism. Bill clapped him on the shoulder. "We'll take it slow," he promised, "just like before." Jonah's anxiety lingered, but a spark of excitement flickered too, urging him to trust what he and Orion had built. As soon as Bill left, Jonah walked to the stable to share the news with Orion in hushed tones. The horse flicked his ears, as if sensing Jonah's conflicted mix of nerves and hope. In the late afternoon sun, dust motes drifted through the stable's warm air, and Jonah recalled the first day he brought Orion home. A horse no one wanted, a man who felt equally overlooked. Now, they stood on the brink of another step forward. Although herding cattle would be more demanding than goats, Jonah reasoned that if they advanced carefully, Orion might develop a genuine aptitude for farm work. That, in turn, could open new possibilities for them both, maybe even a small side income to ease Jonah's persistent worries. Running a hand along Orion's neck, Jonah whispered, "We'll see how it goes, boy. Just like every other hurdle, we'll face this one together." Orion exhaled softly, as if in agreement. Outside, the clouds parted enough for a final beam of sunlight to bathe the yard in gentle gold. Jonah smiled, touched by a sense that each new challenge was forging an unbreakable bond between him and the horse that once had no future. They had weathered storms, both literal and metaphorical, proving that hope could flourish in the most neglected corners. Tomorrow, Jonah would take Orion to Bill's ranch, and together they would confront the next step. He drew a deep breath, listening to the soft shuffle of Orion's hooves behind him, and felt certain that whatever lay ahead, they would face it side by side. A humid stillness clung to the late summer morning when Jonah hitched his trailer and led Orion aboard, ready for the journey to Bill Moseley's ranch. The day felt significant, as if their months of effort would crystallize in this test of courage and trust. Once Orion's ramp was secured, Jonah double-checked every latch before climbing into his truck. Nervous excitement crackled in the air. Although he'd exposed Orion to goats and small obstacles, working with cattle presented a bigger challenge. Yet a quiet hope pulsed in Jonah's chest, reminding him of how far they had come since that day at the luxury stud farm when no one saw Orion's worth. Driving down the narrow road, Jonah peeked at the trailer's mirror. A faint clunk or shuffle now and then told him Orion remained alert inside. He cast his mind back to the times Orion had spooked at even the smallest noise. Those fears had once loomed enormous, but now the horse navigated new situations with a cautious poise. Jonah smiled to himself, recalling the hush of the stable at dawn, how Orion had nickered softly as though ready to embark on another adventure. With each passing mile, Jonah clung to that thought, refusing to let anxiety overshadow their progress. Bill's ranch sprawled across rolling acres, lined with sturdy fencing. In the center, a few low-slung buildings and a broad barn indicated years of careful upkeep. Bill greeted Jonah with a friendly wave, then guided him to an open corral where several brown and white cows congregated. The cattle milled quietly, flicking their tails at flies in the warm air. Jonah parked and hopped out, anxious to see how Orion would handle the sight of larger livestock. He lowered the trailer ramp, speaking in the same soothing tones he always used. Orion snorted, ears pricked at the unfamiliar setting, yet descended the ramp without the frantic steps Jonah once feared. They started by letting Orion observe from a short distance, so he could absorb the cow's presence without feeling cornered. Bill stood beside Jonah, arms folded, explaining his approach. They would keep the herd small, focusing on calm cues so the cattle wouldn't scatter or rush. When it felt safe, Jonah could mount Orion and see if the horse would circle the group, gently guiding them as needed. Jonah swallowed his nerves, aware that Orion fed off his confidence. One slow step after another, they moved nearer the cows, Orion tensing each time one flicked its tail. Jonah murmured steady encouragement, praising every relaxed breath. After a few minutes, Bill signaled that they should try a light herding pass. Jonah eased into the saddle, careful with the reins. Orion shifted his weight, uncertain but not fearful. Bill approached the cattle on foot, coaxing them into a loose formation. Jonah guided Orion in a wide arc, lips pressed together in concentration. The cows began to shuffle forward, heads bobbing as they plodded around the corral. Orion's ears snapped back momentarily, but Jonah felt the horse's tension wane. They settled into a slow walk, steering just behind the cows, urging them left or right as Bill directed. A flurry of movement erupted when one young heifer broke from the group, darting to the side in a skittish burst. Jonah's heart lurched, remembering how swiftly Orion could bolt if startled. Yet, to his relief, Orion danced sideways only a few steps. Jonah tightened his legs around the horse's barrel, murmuring calm words. Bill whistled and waved, drawing the heifer back in. Orion's breathing was rapid, but he did not flee. Instead, the horse held position, letting the cow rejoin the herd. Exhaling shakily, Jonah realized they had just crossed a threshold. Orion had faced a sudden surprise and managed to remain in control. They repeated this exercise several times, each successful pass an act of quiet triumph. Bill beamed from the fence line, calling out pointers on angle and timing. Under the midday sun, Jonah felt sweat bead on his forehead as he and Orion coaxed the cattle around the enclosure. Before long, the group found a smooth rhythm. Orion's steps grew more confident, and Jonah sensed a flicker of pride in the horse's posture. When at last Bill signaled they could stop, Jonah dismounted. He threw his arms around Orion's neck, overwhelmed by gratitude. Bill strode over, grinning, and ruffled Orion's mane. "I'd say you've got a fine ranch horse in the making," he said. They paused for lunch beneath a shade tree. Jonah shared a jug of water with Bill, while Orion stood tied nearby, nibbling on grass. As they ate sandwiches, Bill asked about Jonah's plans. Would he keep training Orion for farm tasks? Maybe think about breeding someday? Jonah laughed softly, remembering how Orion had been dismissed as worthless breeding stock at the stud farm. "He's enough as he is," Jonah replied. "I don't need him to be a champion or a stud. I just want him to be happy." Bill gave a thoughtful nod, respecting Jonah's simple aspiration. That afternoon, Bill and Jonah returned the cattle to their pasture, and Jonah loaded Orion for the trip home. Sunlight dazzled the hills, the day's heat rising in shimmery waves. As Jonah climbed into his truck, he caught Orion's eye through the slats in the trailer. A surge of warmth flooded him. What began with pity and desperation had grown into a bond that sustained them both. The drive home felt lighter, as if Orion's success had lifted a great weight from Jonah's heart. Soon, the battered gate of Jonah's farm came into view. He parked, released Orion, and led him into a freshly cleaned stall. The horse whickered contentedly, brushing Jonah's shoulder with his muzzle. News of Orion's quiet achievements spread around the community. Carla from Erin's gathering came by with a basket of produce. Wanting to see the progress for herself, she gasped in admiration when Jonah described the day at Bill's ranch. Another neighbor, hearing how well Orion moved, offered to hire Jonah for a small herding job if he ever needed extra income. Though Jonah hesitated, uncertain about turning Orion's training into a business, it heartened him to know the possibility existed. Each conversation reminded him that an animal once dismissed as useless now stood at the threshold of real opportunities, fueling the farm's stability. A week later, Jonah walked the fence line beneath a twilight sky. Crickets chirped, and faint silhouettes of bats flitted overhead. He paused by Orion's paddock, resting his arms on the top rail, scanning the farmland that stretched under the dimming light. The orchard, the goats, and the patch of field he hoped to reclaim next season all lay before him. For so long, Jonah had wrestled with doubt, worried that he couldn't afford to keep Orion if times grew hard. But standing there, with the hush of dusk settling around him, Jonah felt certain that Orion had become integral to this land. He smiled, recalling the final conversation he'd had with Lancaster, the polished breeder. No sum of money could match this sense of belonging. Night deepened, but Jonah couldn't resist one more check on his horse. He found Orion in the stable, dozing peacefully. A single lantern illuminated the space, painting soft shadows on the walls. Jonah slipped inside the stall, running a hand over Orion's flank, feeling the gentle rise and fall of the horse's breath. In that soothing presence, he recalled every pivotal step, buying Orion at the stud farm, ignoring sneers, healing old wounds, forging daily trust. He thought of the newspaper photo, the fair's rosette, and the hush in Bill's corral as Orion guided the cattle. Each moment had built them into partners, equals, and maybe even friends. In the quiet stable, Jonah spoke, without knowing whether Orion could understand. "Thank you," he whispered, "for believing in me when I wasn't sure I believed in myself." The horse shifted drowsily, leaning into Jonah's touch. For an instant, Jonah's eyes stung with tears. He remembered his late father's words about raising more than crops, nurturing hope and possibility in places that seemed barren. Orion, once a broken creature, had become living proof that second chances could transform both horse and human. Jonah stood there a long time, absorbing the stable's hush until the lantern's flame danced low. At last, he forced himself to leave, letting Orion drift into restful sleep. Outside, the stars were bright and unwavering. The farm lay silent, every fence post and field shaped by Jonah's dedication. Tomorrow, the routine would continue. Another sunrise would bring new challenges, but also new breakthroughs. With Orion beside him, Jonah was certain they would face whatever arrived. He settled onto the porch for a moment, staring at the faint outline of the barn. In that darkness, memories of scorn and humiliation drifted away, replaced by the knowledge that he and Orion had forged their own destiny. No matter how daunting life's storms became, they would stand together. Smiling softly, Jonah rose, heading inside with an unshakable sense of purpose. He no longer needed the validation of wealthy breeders or onlookers. He had found something far more enduring, a home built on patience, trust, and a horse's quiet faith that some stories, once given a chance, could soar beyond anyone's expectations.